The Footprints in the Snow. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. It was a quiet winter night, the kind where the snow seemed to absorb all the sounds of the world. The cold air was crisp, and the moonlight shone down, casting a pale glow on the ground. A man named James had been walking alone through the woods for hours. The snow was deep, and his footsteps left a trail behind him, a stark contrast to the untouched blanket of white that surrounded him. The only sound was the crunch of his boots against the snow, and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. He had been hiking for a while, and his legs were beginning to ache. But he wasn't concerned. The path had been well traveled, and he was sure he was only a few more hours away from the small cabin he'd rented for the weekend. But as the hours passed, something began to feel off. The silence grew heavier, more oppressive. It wasn't just the stillness of the night, it was as though the entire forest had gone completely still. He paused for a moment, trying to shake off the unease, but when he looked down at his feet, he froze. There were footprints in the snow. Not his. At first, he thought maybe someone else had passed through recently, but then he realized the tracks were fresh, much fresher than his own. And they were strange. The footprints seemed too far apart, as if someone or something had been walking with a long stride. But that wasn't the part that unsettled him. The footprints didn't lead in any particular direction. They appeared to start in the middle of the path, as though someone had simply materialized there. And as he looked closer, he noticed something even more disturbing. The prints weren't just in the snow. They were in the frozen ground beneath it too, as though something had walked through both layers of snow and earth without leaving a trace of its presence anywhere else. James' heart began to race. He turned around, his eyes darting back and forth, but the forest around him remained eerily still. The footprints seemed to follow him, curling around trees, weaving through the snow as though someone was walking right behind him. He quickened his pace, but the sense of being followed only grew stronger. He could feel something or someone close behind, just out of sight. The air felt colder, and the snow beneath his feet seemed to crunch louder with every step. But when he glanced back again, there was nothing. The path was empty. Still, the footprints persisted, trailing just behind him, closer now than ever before. Panic began to rise in his chest. He broke into a run, the crunching of his boots now drowned out by the pounding of his own heart. The cold air stung his lungs as he sprinted, desperate to reach the cabin. But the footprints never stopped. They were getting closer, faster, as though whatever it was that was following him was gaining on him, closing the distance with terrifying speed. James could hear faint footsteps, now too faint to be his own, but unmistakably close. The snow seemed to weigh him down, each step harder than the last. Suddenly, he stumbled and fell to the ground, his hands scraping against the snow as he tried to catch himself. And that's when he saw it right in front of him. The footprints stopped. He stared at them, frozen in place, heart pounding in his chest. Then, something shifted in the snow. The prints began to move again, but this time, they weren't following him. They were advancing. Slowly. Cautiously. James scrambled to his feet and turned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't dare look back, not until he was at the cabin, safe inside. His mind raced with thoughts of what could have made the footprints, whether it was an animal, a person, or something far more sinister. But when he finally made it to the cabin, he locked the door and peered out of the window. The moonlight illuminated the snow-covered ground, and for a brief moment, everything seemed peaceful again. But then, his eyes caught something in the distance. A shape. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. The footprints in the snow led up to the window. And they were still there. It was a quiet winter night, the kind of night where the world seemed to hold its breath. The snow was falling gently, thick and soft, creating a pristine blanket that covered the earth. Each flake shimmered in the pale moonlight as it descended, and the entire landscape seemed suspended in time. The only sounds were the crunch of boots on snow and the occasional rustle of wind through the bare trees, whose skeletal branches creaked like old bones. James had been walking alone in the forest for hours. He had ventured out for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the noise and bustle of the city. The small cabin he rented was nestled deep in the woods, far from civilization. He had set out earlier in the day, planning to return by evening. But now, as the hours slipped by, he realized he had lost track of time. The once familiar path seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, and the world around him felt increasingly isolating. The snow was deep, and with each step, his legs grew heavier. He wasn't used to hiking in this kind of terrain, but he was determined to make it back to the cabin before nightfall. His boots left a trail behind him, a stark contrast against the untouched snow, which still seemed to sparkle with the reflection of the moon. But something felt wrong, and unease settled in the pit of his stomach, a feeling he couldn't quite place. After a while, he stopped to catch his breath, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. The silence was overwhelming now, almost oppressive. It wasn't just the stillness of the night, it was as though the forest itself had gone mute. He strained his ears, trying to hear the faint sound of animals, the wind, anything that might break the unnatural quiet, but all he could hear was his own breath and the occasional crunch of his boots. As he looked around, James realized that the woods had become eerily dark. The light from the moon was obscured by the thick branches of the trees above him, and the shadows seemed to deepen with every passing second. It was as if the forest was slowly swallowing him whole. He took a step forward, and that's when he saw it. Footprints. In the snow. But they weren't his. At first, he thought he was imagining things. Maybe someone else had passed through this way before him. But as he looked closer, he realized the tracks were fresh, much fresher than his own. And they were strange. The prints were large, the stride long, as if someone or something had been walking at an unnaturally fast pace. The snow around the prints was undisturbed, almost as though the person who had left them had moved too quickly for the snow to settle back into place. James' breath caught in his throat. He crouched down, inspecting the footprints more closely. They seemed to be in pairs, as if two legs had made the impressions, but something about them didn't seem quite right. The prints were far too spaced out, the edges of the snow where the prints should have been were too sharp, as if whatever had made them had stepped with an unearthly precision. A sense of dread crept up his spine. He glanced around nervously, wondering if someone was nearby. But the forest was silent. The path was empty. The more he looked at the footprints, the more he became convinced that they weren't human. The shape of the prints was all wrong. The snow was disturbed too sharply, like claws or talons had scraped through it. He had never seen anything like it before. And worst of all, the prints didn't seem to go anywhere. They were scattered, appearing to start in the middle of the path, but without a clear direction. It was as if the person or whatever it was had simply materialized in the snow. James stood up quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced. Could it be an animal, a bear, a wolf? But then why were the prints so strange, and why did they seem to start in the middle of the path, rather than from the forest? Panic began to rise within him. He took a step back and realized the prints seemed to follow him. Not in a linear way, but more erratically, twisting around trees, leading off the path, and then returning to it. His eyes darted nervously around him, searching for signs of movement. The air around him felt colder now, the wind picking up, howling between the trees. He quickened his pace, hoping to outrun whatever was behind him. His boots crunched against the snow, and his breath came in shallow gasps as he hurried down the trail. But the further he walked, the stronger the sensation that something was following him became. He couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching him, lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. The footprints continued to appear just behind him, as if someone or something was walking in his exact footsteps. The air felt oppressive, heavy, as though it were closing in around him. He turned to look, but there was no one there. The path was empty. Still, the feeling of being followed persisted. He glanced over his shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. But each time, there was nothing. The snow-covered ground was undisturbed, except for his own footprints, which led back in the direction of the cabin. He broke into a run, his heart hammering in his chest. The forest around him blurred as he pushed himself harder, the trees seeming to stretch further apart, the path growing narrower and more treacherous. The wind howled in his ears, drowning out the sound of his boots on the snow. He could feel the cold biting into his skin, but he didn't dare stop. And then, he tripped. His legs gave out beneath him, and he fell face first into the snow. He scrambled to catch himself, his hands scraping the cold earth beneath the snow. When he finally managed to stand, something caught his eye. The footprints, they weren't just behind him now. They had circled around him. The prints, which had been behind him moments ago, were now in front of him, leading up to his fallen form, as if whatever was following him had been right there, watching him. It was too much. His panic soared. He looked wildly around him. The forest was eerily still. The footprints stopped, as if whatever had been following him had vanished. But there was no way he was staying to find out. He turned and sprinted towards the cabin, his mind consumed with terror. The cabin was still far off, the journey seeming to take longer than before. Each step was heavier now, his lungs burning from the cold air. But he pushed forward, the thought of reaching the safety of the cabin spurring him on. He couldn't look back. He refused to. When he finally saw the faint light of the cabin through the trees, he felt a surge of relief. He stumbled the last few feet, his fingers trembling as he fumbled for the key in his pocket. He unlocked the door and slammed it shut behind him, bolting it as quickly as he could. Inside, the warmth was a welcome relief, but it did nothing to calm the trembling in his hands. He made sure every window was locked and pulled the curtains shut. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, casting a soft glow in the room, but James could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him. He stood by the window, peering through the blinds. The snow was still falling outside, and everything seemed peaceful again. But as his eyes swept across the yard, they stopped. At the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. Standing completely still, watching him. The figure's shape was indistinct, blending in with the darkness of the trees. But it was there. And it was waiting. The footprints in the snow had led up to the cabin. And they were still there, lingering just beyond the trees. James felt his blood run cold as the figure slowly took a step forward, its form becoming clearer. It was coming closer. And the snow seemed to fall even heavier, as if the world itself had paused, waiting for whatever would happen next. It was a quiet winter night, the kind of night that felt timeless, as if the world itself had taken a momentary pause. The snow, falling in a steady but gentle flurry, blanketed the landscape, covering the trees, the ground, and the air. The full moon hung overhead, casting a pale, ethereal glow that shimmered on the snow and turned the world into a dreamscape of glistening white and shadowy blue. The stillness was so profound, it almost seemed as though the entire world was holding its breath. James had been walking for hours now, lost in the peaceful solitude of the forest. He had rented a small cabin, far from the nearest town, for a weekend retreat to clear his mind. The thought of escaping the noise and chaos of the city, of being alone with his thoughts, had seemed like a perfect plan. The day had gone by without incident. He had hiked, taken in the beautiful, tranquil scenery, and had even made a fire outside, cooking his dinner under the vast, starry sky. But now, as dusk had settled and the hours had bled into night, James realized he had wandered farther than he should have. He was supposed to be on a well-trodden path that would take him back to the cabin, but the path had grown increasingly unfamiliar. The snow was thick underfoot, and the trees, which had been scattered across the landscape earlier, now formed an oppressive canopy, blocking out most of the moonlight. As he walked, the shadows deepened, and he could barely make out the contours of the landscape. The only sound in the woods was the rhythmic crunch of his boots against the snow. He quickened his pace, feeling his legs growing weary with each step. But the silence around him seemed to deepen, and despite his exhaustion, a strange tension coiled in his chest. It was as if the forest itself was watching him, waiting for something. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the woods were holding secrets that he wasn't meant to know. James had almost convinced himself it was simply his imagination when he stopped. He had been walking for what felt like an eternity, but now he found himself frozen in place. His eyes scanned the ground before him, his breath fogging in the cold air, and then he saw them. Footprints. At first, James thought they must have been his own. But then he saw that they weren't. The prints were fresh, barely even covered by the new snowfall. They appeared in the middle of the path, as if someone had stepped into the snow just moments before he did. There was no sign of a person, no sound of movement, nothing to explain why they had appeared so suddenly. The footprints were large, far larger than his own. Their spacing was uneven, the stride unnaturally long, as if whoever had made them was in a hurry. James took a tentative step closer, his heart starting to race. The edges of the prints were sharp, well defined, but they didn't look quite right. Something about them seemed wrong. They were almost too perfect, as if they had been carved into the snow rather than made by the press of a foot. His mind began to race. Could it be an animal? Maybe a bear or a wolf had come this way recently, but no, it didn't make sense. The prints were too organized, too precise. And besides, they didn't seem to have any direction. They were scattered, randomly placed, as though they had started in the middle of the path. James' eyes darted around nervously, trying to make sense of it, but there was no logical explanation. A chill ran down his spine. He stepped back and scanned the surrounding forest, feeling a wave of unease wash over him. The trees were thick, and the night air felt heavy, pressing in from all sides. The snow around him seemed to deaden even the smallest sounds, leaving him alone with the ominous silence. He could feel someone watching him, even though there was no movement. The air seemed thick with something dark, something unseen. Without thinking, James took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the strange footprints. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was lost, or maybe the prints belonged to a hunter or hiker who had passed through earlier. But something in the pit of his stomach told him that wasn't true. The prints were too fresh, and they were too strange. Suddenly, a breeze stirred, ruffling the trees, and the hair on the back of James' neck stood on end. He spun around, half expecting to see someone behind him, but there was nothing. The path stretched on behind him in an unbroken line, his own footprints trailing away into the distance. But then, he noticed something even more disturbing. The footprints, which had been in front of him, now appeared behind him, as if whatever had made them had turned and followed his steps. His stomach twisted with a fresh wave of fear. He looked back again, but the forest was silent. The trees, their branches heavy with snow, loomed like dark sentinels in the distance. Nothing seemed to move. His breath came out in shallow gasps as he quickened his pace, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that clung to him. But no matter how fast he walked, the prints seemed to remain with him, as though they were always just behind him, too close for comfort. He began to feel his pulse quicken, his breath coming in sharp bursts as the adrenaline kicked in. He wasn't just walking through the forest now, he was fleeing from something, and he didn't know what. The snow beneath his feet seemed to slow him down, each step more laborious than the last. His legs burned from the exertion, but he couldn't stop. The path ahead of him grew darker, the trees closing in like a wall. It was as if the forest itself was trying to trap him. And then, he heard it. Footsteps. Not his own, but soft, muffled. The distinct sound of someone or something walking just behind him. The sound was faint, like the scraping of boots against the snow, but it was unmistakable. James stopped dead in his tracks, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned around quickly, his eyes scanning the dark path behind him, but there was no one there. Only the footprints, eerily undisturbed, leading in both directions, as if whoever was following him had vanished into the night. He didn't wait. He turned and ran. His heart pounded in his ears, his feet stumbling through the thick snow as he pushed himself harder, faster. The wind howled around him, and the trees seemed to close in tighter with each passing second. Every time he glanced behind him, the feeling of being followed intensified. But there was nothing visible, at least. The woods were empty. His lungs burned as he gasped for breath, his legs beginning to feel like lead. He had to reach the cabin. It was the only thing that mattered now. The thought of getting back to the safety of the small building, of locking the door behind him, kept him moving. But the moment his eyes caught sight of the cabin through the trees, a cold wave of fear washed over him. He wasn't alone. A shadow moved just beyond the tree line. It was there. A figure, standing perfectly still. The shape of a person or something like it was outlined against the darkness. The figure was tall and impossibly still, blending into the night like a shadow that didn't belong. It was too far away for James to make out details, but he knew without a doubt that it was waiting for him. He stumbled the last few feet to the cabin, hands trembling as he fumbled for the key. The door slammed shut behind him with a resounding thud, and he locked it in a panic, his heart still pounding wildly in his chest. Inside, the warmth of the fire did little to ease the chill that had settled in his bones. His breath came in ragged gasps, but his mind was racing, his thoughts swirling with confusion and terror. Was he just imagining things? Had he gone too deep into the woods, his mind playing tricks on him? Or was there something out there, something he couldn't explain, something that had been following him? He approached the window cautiously, peering through the blinds, his eyes searching the dark expanse of snow outside. The cabin was surrounded by an impenetrable darkness, the trees and snow forming a thick, oppressive wall. For a moment, everything seemed still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. But then, he saw it. The footprints. They were right there. Not just outside the cabin, but leading up to it. They circled the cabin, their eerie trail etched in the snow like an unholy pattern, and at the end of the path stood the figure. It was close now, its form more distinct, though still barely visible in the darkness. The figure was tall, its features hidden in shadow, but it was standing at the edge of the trees, watching him. It hadn't moved since he first saw it. But it was still there. And it was waiting. The footprints continued to spiral around the cabin, coming closer with each turn. The end.